This is the fourth webinar in a series of webinars centered around private sector engagement. I think all the rest of them are available on the IWLearn site. Just to give a very brief introduction to what we're doing, and this is really what keeps me up at night. Every year we need about $4.2 trillion in order to go and fund all the SDGs, and we're only getting about a third of that. And so that really leaves us with a huge financing gap. And you see this across all the different SDGs, whether it's SDG 6, SDG 5, we're very far away from actually hitting those funding goals. And we really need to start looking for more innovative and new sources of funding to really go and start closing this gap. Importantly, we also need to start working with the private sector more, because it's really with the private sector, civil society, and the public sector coming together where we actually start to really close that gap and start bending those curves. And what we've seen in the past is that in the conservation space, especially, the private sector and the civil society is generally quite separate. And so people like myself and roles similar to mine, we're really there to go and really try bring the private sector more in line with what the civil society is doing, and start really sharing learnings across those two different groups, so that we could actually start getting those SDGs closer and closer. In the past, you start to see that the private sector and the tech world have been working really well together. You see a lot of these accelerators and incubators. You see a lot of these professional associations that are being set up, and these are all really nice models and groups and networks to really start to try leverage as we try bring more positive private sector involvement into the conservation space. I want to quickly talk about bankables, and I have covered this in past webinars, but I'll give you a quick introduction. Overall, what we term as a bankable project can also be termed as an impact project, an impact solution, an impact investment. But basically, it has a positive impact on people and nature, and it generates a positive financial return. And it's with this financial return that we can start accessing private finance and private stakeholders. This financial return really has to be able to be attributed to certain stakeholders. And so these kind of returns will be able to go and access equity type investments and loan type investments. We're also able to use things like blended finance, which is taking a little bit of grant money or public finance and using that to get to a point where we can start getting private finance on board. So there's this sort of blend of grant money and investor money in some of these investments. Overall, what we see from the private sector is that they generally are active in a lot of our landscapes, seascapes, and basins, and their operations are very dependent on those areas in order to go and deliver results to their shareholders. And we can also really start to link these groups and these businesses to pressures on these landscapes. Very importantly, they tend to command vast amounts of financial resources, and they're very influential with the public sector. So these are really important allies for us in order to go and meet those SDGs. And we really have to start viewing the private sector as a valuable partner that will really go and help us start to bend that curve and start to get closer to the SDG goals. And the reality is also that without the private sector, we'll never be able to get to the scale that we need in order to start bringing the right change there. So, you know, it's a bit of a sleeping giant when a lot of people look at the private sector. And for us, it's a partner that is sometimes disruptive, sometimes hugely valuable, and our relationships with them are becoming more and more important. We can really work with the private sector to really get them to understand these basins, the seascapes and landscapes that they exist in, and really understand how they can reduce their impact within their operational fences. And this will in turn get them to start managing their risk. And with these groups, financial risk is a very important aspect and something that they tend to understand quite well. And we all know that water risk and climate risk are really starting to become quite tangible and quantifiable in a lot of these areas. And also we can really help them to really reduce their impacts when it comes to climate effects and increase their resilience over time. And from our side, they can really help us to start reducing these landscape pressures that exist. We can start influencing governance to make sure that we are engaging governments in the right way and managing to go and bend policy and governance to go and drive that sustainable landscapes. We get them to start helping us with collective action. And so this is really them then going and bringing other private sector players on board and starting to take place and take activity and action in these multi-stakeholder platforms. And then lastly, they're very helpful when it comes to mobilizing new forms of finance. And if we need to create de-risking instruments or small funds for farmers, the private sector is very helpful when doing that. Overall, within WWF, we really go and try use the landscape approach, and I'll also go through this quite quickly. Basically, we go and select a landscape. This could be a basin, a seascape, and then a subsector of those. We tend to say that they have to be big enough to go and link all the stakeholders together to that ecosystem, but also small enough to actually manage. And you might have multi-stakeholder platforms in one landscape. You might have multiple of them in one landscape. So it's really up to the local teams and the local leads to go and decide who should be involved, how big this place should be, and where those boundaries are. Importantly, we go and engage all the stakeholders, civil, public, and private, and we start building a multi-stakeholder platform with them, where we start to go through the water stewardship type activities. We go and start to really understand the risks and pressures in the region through tools such as the water risk filter or using new and existing reports. And importantly, taking all these stakeholders through these risks and pressures so that they can understand how these pressures are affecting their businesses and how their businesses are affecting the landscape. We then start to look at the grant-based projects, and we really sort of collaboratively plan these and unpack these with our stakeholders. And these are the kind of projects that will go and need grant funding, donor money, and public sources of funding that have traditionally been what we've done a lot in the past. And then as a new one, we need to start looking at bankable projects or impact type projects. And then once again, to plan these with the stakeholders, we'll get these ideas from our corporate partners, from our entrepreneurs in the region, as well as from within our own offices. If people think that there's a great idea, we can go and follow this up and potentially see if it's bankable. There obviously has to be a very strong monitoring and learning piece in this, including ENS safeguards, and these should really be there to go and meet all the different needs of the stakeholders in that landscape. And then lastly, this is really how we start to see a landscape being protected, and then also importantly for the private sector to start de-risking their own operations in that landscape. Was that a question?
Cuando ya me den la presentación, vamos a ir haciendo como porque está muy bien.
Sorry, Carlos, is there a question? No, okay. So, and it's also very important to also go beyond that landscape and to really go and understand the whole value chain there. And so obviously you have that spatial level, which we've just discussed. When we start working with these primary producers in these landscapes, we can really start to engage them and start really understanding where their businesses and what their businesses are linked to. But then to really go through that whole value chain and get to that market and finance level and start to see how we can influence sustainable behaviors, create incentives to change the processes of the groups in that landscape, and then also design and support financial instruments. And as you go through this value chain, you tend to find some big brands, big corporates, big industrial players, and it's with their help that we can really start to get the right behavior taking place in these landscapes. And so you have that landscape, seascape, basin level, and then you have the market and finance level, which is above that. Overall, we really see ourselves as a key piece when it comes to supporting bankable projects. We will not operate these projects, as you'll need a private sector entity that is able to own equity and debt. For our side, we really try to bring science and conservation to these discussions. We have really good in-house water and climate experts. We have a large footprint, and importantly, we know these landscapes quite well. And so we tend to have that local context and that local understanding, which is very key in coming up the right type of interventions. We also have partnerships with global brands, and we have relationships with regulators and governments. And so even though we will never own and operate these projects, we are really there to go and leverage our own network and leverage our own resources in order to get these projects off the ground. What we wanted to do for this webinar is to go through some GEF projects. I went and held some discussions with the leads to understand them a bit better and to sort of identify some opportunities and focus areas. I went and reviewed generally all the activities that could be bankable and that we could be using the private sector to really finance. And then I chose one to cover in a little bit more detail. But then once again, this is a desktop exercise. So local context is very, very important. Understand understanding the different cultures, the different social landscape, as well as the environmental landscape, is really key to coming up with the right interventions, because even though something is bankable doesn't mean that the right impact is there, and also vice versa. And so for us, it's really important to make sure that we have that impact, we have the right impact going into these landscapes. And then for us to start to unpack how can we use this as a bankable project so that we can start leveraging the private sector in a positive way. But then also how can we use a financial model to go and lock in the right behaviors. So this is a sort of a bit of an unpacking of the process, but on the ground knowledge and research is also very, very important, which this session will be lacking a little bit. Great. So I'd like to hand over to our first speaker to go and take us through the Orange-Senqu River and the project around that. Are you able to hear us?
Yeah, I'm able to hear you.
Yes. Perfect. Would you like to? I'll control the slides. Do you want to carry on?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I can go to the next slide. Next slide. Okay. The name of the project that we are implementing on the Orange-Senqu River officially is called Support to Orange-Senqu River.
I think might have just lost connection. I think I'm going to turn video off to see if this helps.
Program implementation. So it's implemented by UNDP.
Sorry, Zimbabwe, we lost you for a second there. Do you mind going back to the beginning of your slide?
Okay, I was just giving the official name of the project. It's Support to the Orange-Senqu Strategic Action Program Implementation. It's a 5-year project implemented by UNDP, executed by Orange-Senqu, funded by GEF, and it's really to support the member states to implement the priority actions of the SAP. Okay, move to the next slide. Yeah, so the overall objective of the project really is strengthening the joint management capacity for implementation of the basin-wide integrated water resources plan, as well as on one part, but as well as demonstrating environmental and socioeconomic benefits of the ecosystem-based approach, water resources management, through implementation of the sub-priority actions. So it's a mouthful, but basically it's meant to promote joint management capacity of the 4 member states in the way they go about business. Okay. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, basically the project is implemented through 4 components. The first component looks at institutional and policy reform and technical capacity building towards enhanced transboundary basin planning and joint management. So, and then the second one looks at reducing stress on water resources quality. And then the third component looks at addressing changes to the hydrological regime through the source to sea application. And then the last component, component 4, looks at addressing land degradation, specifically by working on invasive species. The specific one is called Prosopis in Namibia. Okay. Next slide. Yeah, so just to highlight a little bit, the component 1, which is institutional strengthening, the elements that we address, the first one, and outcome 1 is building the capacity of Orange-Senqu is the river basin organization created in the year 2000 by the 4 member states who share this river. And so we are strengthening their capacity to innovate and finance and find strategic ways of financing their activities beyond funded initiatives. Okay. This is where this particular discussion becomes useful. And then outcome 1.2 looks at Orange-Senqu's joint basin planning capacity strengthening, as well as data sharing and information management, so that decisions are based on information. And then the third outcome looks at within the lifespan of the project, the 5-year lifespan, the strategic action program, as well as the national action programs are going to be updated, revised and updated. And then we have an outcome 1.4, looking at transboundary environmental and social assessment guidelines endorsed by member states. So basically, to find a way of doing environmental and socio-economic assessments basin-wide. And then the last one, outcome 1.5 under component 1, looks at building the capacity of Orange-Senqu to communicate effectively, as well as usage of data, instead of duplicating data, but make use of the data that's already. Next slide. Yeah, so component 2 then, the one which looks at addressing water quality issues, basically has 3 outcomes. The first one is we aim at helping the 4 member states create a basin-wide water resources quality monitoring system. And then specifically, outcome 2.2, in one of the member states, Lesotho, which is where the river originates from, we're going to work on trying to reduce pollution from different sources, but specifically for the one focusing on from industries. The textile industry in Lesotho is of interest in terms of this particular element, but we want to investigate even other possible point sources of pollution and try and ensure that mechanisms are put in place to address how this pollution can be reduced because of its impact on the whole basin. Then outcome 2.3 looks at quantity and quality of groundwater in Botswana. So basically, the intervention is to improve the desalination of water. As you know, Botswana is basically a dry country with very minimal surface water. So the intervention is to try and help how to help desalinate the water in a low-cost intervention. Move on to the third component. Yeah, the third component, basically, which looks at changing hydrological regime, has 2 outcomes. Outcome 3.1, which looks at basin-wide environmental flows, just to ensure that there are agreed environmental flows, the various requirements, as well as agreements actually, and the implementation part of this. And then outcome 3.2 looks at critical ecosystem, rehabilitation of the critical ecosystem at the river mouth. Basically, both on the South African and on the Namibian side, this is a Ramsar site, but we note that there has been some dilapidation on the South African side, and so this intervention aims at rehabilitating that so that they regain the Ramsar status. You can move to component 4. Yeah, so component 4, the one that looks at land degradation, the specific intervention is to look at invasive species, but through an integrated management system, which where the communities derive a livelihood around the control of this particular invasive species. Because any other person can control prosopis, but why use GEF investment in such an undertaking? It's because of the additionality of the fact that communities are going to derive a livelihood, and the government is also committed to take on this program beyond the life of the project. So specifically, the outputs related to that are that we're going to map the distribution and abundance of these invasive species in the basin, so that we know really what is we are up against, and then pilot the clearing of this and ensure that the communities are getting economic benefits. So basically, in terms of the components, this is what this particular intervention is about. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much for that. So just quickly going through a lot of what was mentioned, there are a few bankable opportunities that sort of come to the fore. The first is around the desalination plant. In Lesotho, there's quite a textile industry, especially around denim and footwear, and so there could be some potential textile factory upgrades that could lead to cost savings for the actual factories, and then reduced impacts on the water sources. We also have job creation opportunities in Namibia around alien species clearing, and potentially making those alien species into some sort of product that can be sold. You see a lot of water hyacinth type projects where they turn it into building materials or sustainable charcoal. And then lastly, in South Africa and Namibia, we can really start to look at climate smart agriculture and see how we can leverage small agricultural funds in order to go and move from flood irrigation to drip irrigation, irrigation, potentially add additional revenue sources from an agriculture perspective, and then also move some of the farms over to renewable energy like solar. I mean, from my side, I think let's quickly look at some of the desal options that we're already seeing being utilized out there. Solar desal is quite a new technology that has really grown a lot quite recently. And we're really starting to see small-scale desal plants being able to be primary run off solar with potential access to grid for the nighttime and for the sunless days. You also have a lot of wind reverse osmosis systems that have also really dropped down in price. And these are the kind of things that are quite deployable and quite a known quantity in places like Botswana. Quite a new thing that is also really, we're starting to get a lot of data and a lot of knowledge around is the nature-based solutions in the form of reed bed systems or slow sand type filters. And if we get the right people to come to the areas and really go and assess these areas, we can potentially start looking at green infrastructure as opposed to grey infrastructure in these regions. Overall, there are a lot of options that exist for desal. There is a need to avoid diesel or fossil-powered desal options. We tend to be swapping carbon for fresh water, but there's always going to be a need to have backup systems, and sometimes it's just not possible, and these options are your only options. It's quite useful to connect these type facilities to existing grids because you tend to have an excess of solar or a deficit when it comes to nighttime activity, and so it's good to keep these kind of infrastructure running when they need, but also really understanding what's happening in the solar and wind world is quite interesting because solar is really dropping in cost, becoming cheaper to use panels, and they're becoming more and more suppliers offering them in these markets. So we're really taking reverse osmosis, which is quite a given and quite a known quantity, and we're starting to link it with quite interesting combinations which aren't exactly mainstream yet, but we're really starting to see some very interesting improvements and cost reductions coming through every day. At the moment, these renewable desal plants tend to be less than 10,000 cubes a day, which is for this kind of project quite helpful. But importantly, we're really seeing that grow over time. They're not quite there at the large scale yet, but we're starting to see some very interesting projects being launched that are really starting to push these outputs quite high. And then lastly, with nature-based solutions, we tend to find there's a lot of pushback when we start bringing in nature-based solutions. People always worry that there's no data or knowledge or science behind them. But when you really start to look, there's some very interesting groups like Daltaris from Netherlands that are really becoming these green infrastructure experts. And when we start having these options and these kind of discussions in these landscapes, it's very helpful to go and bring these experts to the table because they tend to be further away. But we really need to get nature-based solutions in at the right time so that we can really start to understand whether or not we can have a green solution or a green hybrid solution. Nature-based solutions tend to be quite nice in the first stage of water treatment, but there are things that unfortunately at the moment we just can't use nature-based solutions to do. So understanding the local context, the local needs, and getting the right people there is very important. Overall, you see these opportunities tend to have high capex amounts, so it costs a lot to start them, but generally low opex, so the operational costs tend to be quite small. You see some reductions in wind because you can tend to use smaller turbines for wind reverse osmosis. So you can buy secondhand turbines off the market from groups that are actually buying bigger ones for their grids. And this can actually make the capex quite low. And also we can really start to leverage support funding from development and climate funds, and then also emergency funds to go and reduce this initial capex outlay. On the private sector, and especially in Botswana, there's a strong need to have this kind of technology available to go and support agriculture. And so the private sector, I think, has a large stake in a project like this, in this kind of example. It's quite important to really start to understand how we can use this technology to go and de-risk their own businesses, and so that we can get their support through these incentives to really go and back these kind of projects. But then importantly, we also need to make sure that communities and other groups can access the benefits of this, and it doesn't just become a private sector type type project. Also, very importantly, the local price of water needs to be understood. We can really start to use blended finance to reduce this cost passed on, but in a lot of these regions there is no price for water, and when that's the case, that sort of step from no price to some price is generally quite a big hurdle. There are many ways to get around that, but it's very important to really understand that local price and also the price that the private sector is willing to pay. And then lastly, what we see is that these systems tend to be quite small scale and quite simple, and they can really be maintained by local companies and groups. And this is a really a good way to start looking at how to go and build this kind of industry and this kind of supplier network within a country and not have to be dependent on external contracts the whole time. Lastly, there's a very nice example of this in South Africa, where they have a small scale solar and desal plant for a town. In this case, they actually use drought funding and emergency funding as well as some development funding in order to do it. And you start to see that this sort of solar desal link on this kind of scale is becoming more and more viable from an economic perspective. Overall, we really see the financial revenue coming from the price of water and then potentially from support from the public sector. When we start looking at the different sources of funding, from CapEx, you can really start to leverage climate and development finance to go and reduce the CapEx costs. You can start to get your private sector on board to also go and start financing the first few pilots or the first few models of this, and then to go and see if you can get public finance support in order to go and reduce the overall CapEx cost. But then from an operational perspective, you'll be using the price of water and then some subsidies from the public to pay for this. What we really see that if you can start reducing the CapEx need of this kind of technology, then the OpEx tends to be very, very cheap. And what we also can see is that if we use the private sector to really start to prove the concept and fund these pilot studies, then we can really start scaling that throughout the country or throughout the region through private and public sector support. And then lastly, these solutions tend to be quite modular and scalable. And so you can really start with pilot sites, but then you can really start to scale them quite quickly. And what we really see is that one company was able to offer you all the different sizes of plants. So it's a really nice way to start piloting things, but then scaling quite quickly afterwards. Any questions and answers on this case? Just checking the chat box. If there's anyone who wants to raise their hands or even type a question, please do so.
Liana McManus here. I just have a quick question for you.
Sure.
What are you able to demonstrate the environmental benefits within what scale of time? Because I think you can deal with return of investments at scale, I don't know, within probably 5 years or if not shorter. But I was just wondering if the environmental benefits, especially when it comes to water quality, if there are demonstrable or potential for demonstrable benefits within the same time scale. Because I think at the end of the day, we want to show both the economic and environmental benefits go hand in hand, although understandably, you know, the processes may take longer for the ecological benefits to be made manifest.
No, I totally agree, and I think it's also the context of the project where that becomes quite important. You see a lot of these kind of units and these kind of implementations happening by the coast, and actually using salt water to desalinate, which is a lot more difficult with that perspective. And then obviously within Botswana, it is also, I think, very important to go and understand before you start this kind of project, you know, what are you actually trying to achieve from an environmental perspective, And when we look at the case in Botswana, the one group that really jumps out is the cattle industry and the cattle agriculture there. And if you can have something like this within a well-managed cattle sort of rangeland, you can start seeing that rangeland becoming a better carbon sink. You can start seeing the environmental benefits a lot more, instead of having these people driving their cattle to available water sources which gets overused and dried up, and lots of degradation around them, and then moving to the next one. So yeah, short answer is context is important, and really coming up with that impact that you want to measure and achieve in the beginning. And I think from a data and from an experience perspective, the example I showed you will be very difficult to show that. I'll see if I can find some other ones. I know that there's one in Kenya that will potentially be able to do that. So I'll also send that link through after this call.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Sure. Any other questions before we move on to the MAR? Brilliant. And it's probably also good to mention that I'm a bankable person that has a water background, but it's also very important to have the technology experts, the financial experts, the CSOs, the public sector, everyone around the table when it comes to discussing these options and really developing these options, because you don't want to start incentivizing the wrong behaviors. You also don't want to start using grant money in order to de-risk businesses while at the expense of local community. So those multi-stakeholder platforms and the right experts is a very important step when coming up with these interventions. Perfect. So Carlos, let me hand over to you.
Hello, you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, thank you, Karen, and all of you guys for the opportunity for this quick presentation. What I want to say is that I'm not a bankable person, but I'm very concerned about the health of the Mesoamerican Reef ecoregion, but also with the people that are living around not only with the protected areas, but also with the watersheds, and we prioritize for this project. So maybe we can move to the next slide. So the project that we have from GEF is, at the end of the day, implemented by the Central American Commission on Environment and Development. This is a huge regional body composed by the ministries of the environment in the 8 countries, coming from Mexico to Panama, including the Dominican Republic. So our goal in the project is we want to contribute to conservation and sustainable use of the resources that are shared by 1, 2, 3, 4 different countries. And our goal is to work into the mainstreaming, the Reach to Reef focus in the project. Of course, our main objective in the project is to consolidate the regional collaboration, which is not easy because we are working in Mexico, which is a huge country. And then we have Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras that are small countries compared to Mexico. But at the end of the day, there's 4 different countries compose the Mesoamerican Reef region. And our project is looking for the consolidation of regional collaboration, but also improving the institutional capacities to mainstreaming the Reach to Reef focus in the area. Can you please move to the next slide? Okay, so what I want to emphasize here is that our project is looking to work in alliance, and we were looking also to focus on institutional capacities coming from the different governments in the region, especially those ministries that are dedicated to the environment, social development, but also people who are working in the water resources, especially natural resources secretariats or ministries. Can we move, please? And then we have some strategic lines, and what I want to speak here is that our project is more focused on trying to strengthen the governance platforms in the region. We already know when we started the project that the governance is a very important issue to work as a transboundary project. We also understood that this project is looking to create, consolidate, and sometimes implement the public policy in the countries related to watersheds. In other cases, we are working with wetlands, mangroves, coral reef. So we have different thematics involved in the policy that we are trying to support in every country and also as a regional level. As I said, we are working with the CCAD, which is the Central American Commission on Environment and Development. And we are committed to support the Ministries Council and also the ministries in the area in terms of three regional priorities. One is the restoration decade, which is associated to the bond challenge. The second one is the blue economy. And the third one is more related to the quality of water. In terms of that, because we don't have a lot of time for explanation, what I want to emphasize is that our project is focused on improving the governance, working with the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, trying to engage the private sector, and also working closely with local communities. So this is the main focus of the project. In terms of that, and speaking about the private sector engagement, we are working in three different components. The number one is more related to policy. The second one is more related to working in local watersheds, transboundary watersheds. And the third one is more connected to engage actors in local communities in conservation and restoration of mangroves, coral reef, fisheries. And in terms of the private sector, we are working with sugarcane, oil, palm, and shrimp industry in Belize, for example. So we are connected to the policy. We are connected to the work in the implementation of at least 7 different pilot projects in the region, including mangrove restoration and conservation and coral reef restoration and conservation. With this, what I want to explain, because I don't have a lot of time, specifically to the mangroves, we were, when you see the slide in the number 7, we were trying to build on alliances. We have a lot of people in regional organizations that are working in the Mesoamerican Ridge region, and they are doing a great job. So our idea was to join efforts in terms to specific things. In terms of the mangroves, I think 2 months ago in Guatemala City, we held a regional workshop. I think it was 80 people invited to the meeting. And our objective was to produce, first of all, a regional strategy for restoration and conservation of mangroves. The second thing that we produced with this workshop was an action plan for 6 months, and then we are going to build something for long term, because it's going to be a strategy for the region. And then with Mar2R, our project, we are going to implement at least 4 different projects for restoration and conservation in mangroves and coral reefs, fisheries, and supporting the private sector with the shrimp industry, looking for best practices and certification processes. So with the workshop, we identified thematic and priority sites to implement these thematic projects in the next 2 years. So we are so happy to share with you the information that we produce I already sent to Kieran the information. I apologize because now it's still in Spanish, but we are going to translate in English. And we are very excited participating in this webinar, not only for the information that we are having now, but also because we think that bankable projects, and we believe 100% on that, bankable projects can build good governance in areas, good involvement, not only with the private sector, but also local communities. And we are very interested in follow up on this conversation, because we think the Mesoamerican Reef now is Next year is going to be very important in terms of political issues, and I want to finalize my presentation with this. The next year, MAR2R as a project will work together with the Central American Commission on Environment Development to create a regional agenda and with the public and private sector regarding tourism. We are going to have a regional agenda for conservation and restoration of mangroves, coral reefs, and also fisheries involving communities. But the most important thing will be the political statement that we want to promote, which is Tulum plus 23. So many years ago, the 4 countries signed an agreement working with to work and enhance the governments in the area. And we think that Tulum plus 23 is going to be engaged not only with the sustainable development goals, but also specific actions to work more closely with the private sector. I'm sorry if I was so quickly, but I know it's only 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And yeah, I think this project really looks interesting. And I think this one and the last one is definitely something that from WWF perspective, we want to get more involved with and support on the bankable side. And I have the links at the end just to go and potentially get some more support for everyone else on the call. If we go and start looking at some of the bankable opportunities, we obviously mentioned sustainable fisheries and aquaculture. Certifications are very important there, but we can also start to see that some of this tech coming out is becoming a very important enabler. We're seeing SMS-based catch systems being trialed throughout Africa. We're starting to see a lot of satellite and data-focused policing and regulation, which is quite interesting. And it's also really nice to go and bring these different groups around the table to start seeing what kind of technology they could potentially deploy to go and let us hit our visions and our goals. The sustainable tourism sector, and I think there's an expert on this call, which is really nice, but also working with them, looking at standards and certification, and also really engaging them as part of water stewardship activities is very important. Sustainable agriculture is something that I do a lot of, and here we have very important certifications and standards. We have climate smart agricultural switches. We could really start to do additional crops and really try help reduce monoculture in many of these regions. And also we can potentially add additional revenue streams through the use of solar and using the sort of agricultural waste for additional products. And then lastly, there's a lot of new and existing funds that are coming out around agriculture. Every country we go to, there's a small farm agricultural fund that's been set up, and understanding how to access these things and what kind of requirements and policies these ones have, I think is very, very important. And then lastly, we have the mangroves and coral restoration piece, which I'll go into a bit more detail about. Overall, this is a new sector for me. I tend to be a lot more fresh and a lot more sweet than salty, but I've just been spending a couple of weeks in Mozambique along the Zambezi Delta, really looking at mangroves in detail and how we can get some bankable projects around them. What we're really seeing in the mangrove side is some very interesting examples of combinations of mangrove protection and restoration, and then aquaculture, generally around shrimp or crab. Mangroves have a very important flood risk mitigation and flood protection as a resource, and also they're very important from a carbon perspective, whereas we can start looking at aquaculture from a livelihood and also as a way to go and safeguard mangroves and reduce deforestation. What we're really seeing is that you can start to really link up these two different models into one model, so they can really start playing off each other and start supporting each other. And you can start using carbon finance in order to really go and get a consistent and sustainable revenue stream into the mangrove protection. We can start to look at the different grey and green infrastructure that we need for flood risk protection. And it's very important to use mangroves and include them as part of the infrastructure plans of the region. This is something that, especially in Mozambique, we've seen a lot of the regional groups coming together and really looking at mangroves in a different way after Cyclone Ida. And you start to see that there's a lot of financing opportunities and a lot of money around infrastructure that would generally go to grey type infrastructure that could also go and start supporting mangroves. Also, we need to start really understanding why they're being deforested, and each region is quite different. People don't tend to like cutting down mangroves for fun. There's always a reason behind it. In Mozambique, it's around building materials and charcoal for cooking. So stopping deforestation needs to go hand in hand with other projects in order to go and give them access to a cooking fuel and to sustainable building materials. And so we really have to start looking at these projects linked to everything else. And those sustainable fuel for cooking and the building material projects can also become bankable projects in the region that can really go and help strengthen these. Lastly, there's a lot of payment for ecosystem service type schemes that can be included when it comes to mangroves. This is a model that is sometimes bankable and sometimes not bankable, depending on who you talk to. It's sometimes voluntary and sometimes you can actually get it put into law. But this is also another funding stream that we can start directing towards mangroves in order to support them. With aquaculture, we need to be also careful around how much impact we want versus the scale of the aquaculture. As we increase the scale of the aquaculture, we start to see that impact being reduced somewhat. And so this discussion and this planning is very important here. But what we also see is that aquaculture with mangroves tend to have lower costs than traditional aquaculture. And so you really start to see higher margins coming through. And these aquaculture farms tend to be more resilient to climate changes, and as water levels change and as temperatures change, the mangroves tend to form buffers and support the sort of climate resilience there. And lastly, with all of these projects, we really need to see if we can build certification and standards into this model. Having them as separate and having them outside the model is very risky sometimes. We really need to start linking livelihoods with financial and economic activity, with certification, with safeguards, and really creating one model that is all linked, as opposed to doing multiple projects where one could fall over and not happen, whereas others could be picked up and taken. And if we go and bundle it all together, we tend to have a higher chance of getting all the right activities going forward. From the private sector perspective, shrimp and crab can be premium products, and so that we can really start to look through that value chain and start seeing which brands and which corporates have a value for shrimp and crab. We can really start to see that these shrimp and crab can have organic type certifications. You can even start linking them to sustainable mangroves and FSC type certifications, and so it's important to go and look throughout this value chain and seeing where the shrimp and crab is being bought and sold. And then also looking at that very important tourism sector around the area, because these players tend to like supporting local activities and sustainable activities, especially when it comes to increasing the value to their sectors. And if the tourism sector is big enough, you can generally get the whole industry to go through them. These combinations of models really go and de-risk the involvement of the private sector. In this case that I'm showing now, there are many different streams coming into this model. We have carbon finance, we potentially have PES, we have higher margin and resilient business cases, and so when the private sector gets involved, the whole risk is not on them. There's going to just be a portion of risk that they will have a vulnerability to. And so it's really nice to go and unpack each of the different financial schemes, really understanding who owns the risk, who owns the value, and where the private sector can take part. And then also to work with that local government and the regional governments to really ensure that we can improve policy and governance around these areas, to really go and prevent large aquaculture that is not done in a sustainable way moving in, to potentially go and put back a lot of the work that's been done. So it's a very, there's a very important play here for the private sector. We need to balance scale, we need to balance impact, and we really need to see which parts of the private sector can really help us with. And access to market could be one of those pieces. If we are transporting the shrimp and crab for a long way, we could potentially have models where we have markets set up, processing plants set up in between, which will then give access to higher prices for the aquaculture groups, and then also go and link that value chain with the premium brands and corporates. And so the private sector can really be that in-between step to go and really make sure that we get the right money and the right activities happening in this area. There's a really nice example, it's the wrong one, here it is. There's a really nice example of this from an actual GEF project in Vietnam, which they did a lot of data that came out showing that there was actually some very interesting learnings and some very interesting outputs. This is something that we can really go and get learnings from up and down Africa as well as Asia. But then very, very importantly, we need to go and make sure that this works properly in these regions that we're actually deploying the projects in, making sure we have the right biodiversity mix, the right type of aquaculture is very important, and we need to also be careful that the private sector doesn't push us to start having different products that are not part of that region's mix. Overall, we can really start to see that we'll start getting revenue from sales, and that access to market is an important step that should be really viewed as a potential price differential, and then to go and set up these different aquaculture activities. There are some funds that are available that will able to do this. We can also start creating a whole mangrove fund from all of the different revenues from mangroves, and start to go and loan out money to aquaculture partners from the mangrove fund that get paid off over time. And then lastly, we can start getting the private sector to also play a role and start creating instruments that allow access to money, setting up these aquaculture operations in the right way, and then also to be able to go and get a payback for those loans in the long term. As I said in the beginning, having these different models all linked together really makes sure that we can lock in impacts as well as get the right kind of behavior and practices in these markets. And then really understanding all those value chains could be an important price factor when doing these kind of projects. Great. So that was the last example from my side. Any questions on the MAR and the mangrove aquaculture combination? Once again, this is quite a new area for me, so I've been looking at it for about 4 weeks now. But it's a very important area, and I think that link with freshwater and seascapes is becoming more and more important in the work that I do. I see no question. Oh, there we go.
Yeah. I am not very familiar with the Mesoamerican barrier reef. As a Philippine US citizen, I'm more familiar with Southeast Asia. And I guess my sense is that very often the shrimp aquaculture in Southeast Asia was a major driver in demolishing mangrove stands. So I think learning from that lesson, I would be very circumspect in the way that there is a great balance between the sustainable use of the mangrove, not just for flood, but by its own nature in terms of the various ecosystem services that it provides, in addition to just being a natural aquaculture for shrimps and fish. So perhaps that's sort of like a general expression of mindful concern in terms of how those ecosystem services are factored in the balancing of creating sustainable wealth out of the ecosystem, impacting livelihoods, but also maintaining it as a major source of flood protection and biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And we see this all the time, that we really go and start to understand these different groups, these different industries that are putting a lot of pressure on these ecosystems. And we have a situation in Cameroon where we are looking at palm oil in Cameroon, and palm oil is actually from Cameroon, and it's actually a very good crop in Cameroon that we tend to not have to deforest in order to grow it. And we really need to go and make sure that we have the right crops, the right industries in the right places. At the same time, we also need to be very wary of what these industries have done in the past, and choosing partners and choosing private sectors to work with is very important. We should be forgiving on one hand, but we should also make sure that we have the right partners, because if we incentivize the right behaviors, we still need the right partners to go and do those right behaviors. And we need to really go and lock in these behaviors as much as possible into these financial models. Otherwise, and you see it a lot with these kind of combinations, if we split mangrove restoration and aquaculture, you'll tend to see private finance will mobilize a lot quicker than public or carbon finance will. And so you might have aquaculture really growing faster than what that ecosystem should be supporting from a mangrove perspective. And so really coming to the table with those experts in the beginning to go and actually map out how fast each of those things can grow. Doing this kind of project in an area that has to be reforested tends to take a lot longer than doing it in an area that has existing mangroves that have to be protected. And we need to really sort of link those two things together and understand the impacts of those two things before we go down that path. So thank you so much for your comment. Really appreciate it. I think there was a hand from someone. Did someone put their hand up? Lilia, was it yourself? Natalie, I think it was you.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. And thank you again to everybody. I think what I would like to actually ask, my question is not so much for Kieran, but it's actually for Zimbabwe and our other project on the webinar, to find from you, looking at the ideas that Kieran has proposed for your projects, how feasible do you think it would be, or are you excited about the examples proposed by Kieran? Do you think it's something that you could actively take up in your project? Thank you.
Yes, in my case, I'm excited. In fact, I must say that it's so timely, because we are just at the point where we are now putting out consultancies to help the sites. So I think the input from this particular webinar gives me information that helps me check the proposals that will be coming from the consultants. It broadens the menu, so to speak. So it's very, very useful and very timely. I'm excited.
Thanks for that.
Yes, thank you. In our case also, we are excited in the Mar region, because at the end of the day, we are going to produce next year, as I explained very quickly, an agenda based on the blue economy, working with the 4 countries in the region, and also this regional strategy that is going to focus on mangroves, but also with the intention of looking the alliance with the public, the private, but for the most important for us is the communities and the local involvement. And because the effects of every action that we are doing from the ridge to reef, at the end of the day, communities are working in the protected areas or outside of the protected areas. So we are very interested to continue engage with this initiative, because when we say bankable projects, we are always thinking on the private sector, right? I think it's more an alliance, working with the public, with the private, and the involvement on local communities. In our case also, it's very important because we have 5 different platforms for coral reefs and aquaculture and sugarcane and oil palm. And then what we are going to do in February next year is going to have a meeting. We are calling them champions. And every thematic, for example, we have at least 3 people working in Mexico and Honduras, Belize and Guatemala that are going to attend the meeting for mangroves, other 5 for corals, 2 or 3 for oil palm. So we want to do this, I don't know what can I say that, but integral and platform for champions, people who knows what is happening in the region, and the private sector is included from the sector, the tourism sector, the shrimp sector, the sugarcane, and the oil palm. So it's going to be the first time in which a project in the region is going to have this champion meeting. So we are planning to have in February. So you are invited, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And I think this is also very important to say that, you know, we don't need to do these projects by ourselves. There are a lot of supportive groups out there. WWF and our office has just launched the DFCD Fund, which is the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development. This is a partnership between 2 development organizations, WWF and SNV, and 2 investment partners, Climate Fund Managers and FMO. And this kind of fund really goes and supports these bankable activities with grants and technical assistance and expertise to the point where we can hand them over to investors. It's a really exciting time to be thinking about this, and there's more and more funds like DFCD coming up. And I think us really going to these different groups, really talking to the private sector, bringing them, as Carlos said, around the table in the form of champions is it's a really encouraging way to go and really see and really get these bankable projects off the ground. Thank you so much for my 2 co-presenters. I'm definitely going to be chatting to them after this and in early next year around DFCD and potential opportunities, as well as also sharing a lot of the groups and the models that we've come across with. Our Bankable Nature Solutions group is also coming up with a blueprint guide and a manual to really go and start highlighting more and more bankable type projects. And we also have really interesting groups like CPIC, the Coalition for Private Investors in Conservation, which are also doing similar things. So there's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of people interested in this kind of intervention. And there's also very recently a lot more grants and technical assistance being made available to go and support these projects from that idea stage to the investable stage. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you, Zimbabwe and Carlos. Really greatly appreciated. And thank you again to the projects from the GEF IW community who made the time to join this call. Please do not hesitate to let Mish, myself, or Kieran know if you have any further questions about this or how we can be of further assistance to you in your work. Wishing you all a lovely weekend ahead, and I will speak to you soon. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, thank you again, and Merry Christmas to everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Merry Christmas.